With church hats, as I mentioned, that traditionally a lot of the traditional church organizations are ones where some of the women participate in wearing hats, and it tends to be older women. I'm approaching 50 next year. I can't believe I'm saying that. And I have worn hats occasionally throughout my life. However, I see the value in that. I'm planning to join my sister in making it an every Sunday thing with hats. With hats, as I mentioned, they were part of the greater society. There was a time, way back in the day, where a woman could not come out without a hat, and it did not matter the season. There were different eras where it was the appropriate attire to wear a hat and gloves, even if you just go into the grocery store or you're going to lunch, or some places where we might wear flip-flops and some of everything today. Those persons would cringe if they saw some of the ways that we dress today when we're going to do things where they thought it was a formality. With my family's hat legacy, part of this program came out. It was just an idea, only because I noticed, in particular in my maternal line, a lot of women, pictures of a lot of women wearing hats. And as my sister mentioned, our maternal grandmother, she was a big hat wearer, and Grandma was, a lot of her stories that she talked about when she was younger and so forth, they centered around hats. As far as tracing my family history, and you all should have gotten a green card, because my approach to this whole thing is through family history. That's how all this evolved, through my family history and then looking at different aspects of my family history. One thing I noticed was the hat history. If you don't get a card, someone can give you one. And so, as far as my known history of where I can trace back as to where I have pictures from, with my ancestor, Lavinia Jeffries Bullock, who was born in 1864 during the Civil War, and she died in 1951. And Grandma Bean, she wore little caps made of fabric. Those are caps she probably sewed herself. From stories I've heard about her, she continued to wear clothing from the 1800s, which was the long skirts and dresses and bonnets and those type of things. Grandma Bean was a very religious woman, and she was known for the way she entered the church. Now, a lot of us, we just enter the church and, we take a seat in the back or whatever, and, then we participate in service. Well, Grandma Bean didn't believe in that. She believed that you go into the house, you enter into this courts with praise and thanksgiving. And so when she would go into the church, she would be like with a party, so to speak. From stories I've heard about her, they say that as soon as her foot would touch the ground, she would start saying holy. So she started before she got in the church. And then as she would proceed to the door, she would shout holy. And some people say she would stomp at the door. So definitely would get everybody's attention. They said that if the church service was a little dead, that she definitely would light it up. They said she would march down the aisle shouting holy and speaking in tongues, and then she would go to her seat and kneel and pray. And so everybody I've talked to about her, and these persons were either young adults or children from their memories of her, they all say the same thing. Isn't that a great thing to be remembered for all these years? And so my hat history, as I know it, can be traced back to her. And then her daughter, and so she wore those little caps made of fabric. Her daughter, Belle Bullock Johnson, who's my great-grandmother, she was born in 1890 and died in 1982. And she wore simple hats. A lot of the pictures were felt hats, maybe with a simple band, nothing elaborate, but maybe possibly a step up from what her mother would have had, those homemade fabric hats. Then Belle's daughter, my maternal grandmother, Emma Johnson Thornton, who was born in 1922 and she died in last July. She wore, well, throughout her life, and looking at pictures from my childhood, I remember her wearing just simple hats, sometimes wearing those hand-sewn hats in our church, in the Holiness Church. I remember what they call the missionary circle, and the missionary circle's uniform was a white dress and this white cap, and all the women wore double knit then. This was like in the 70s from what I remember. And so you had the matching white cap, almost like a turban and so forth, which was not that attractive, but that was their uniform, I remember. And I know I have some persons in here from that church who remember that same thing. So during that time, my grandmother would wear, from my childhood, she would wear those simple hats. However, as she progressed, or rather as her children progressed, because I don't remember her ever buying hats. They were given to her either as gifts or just, you know, from her cousin that my sister mentioned. Her cousin always had the fly hat, so grandma always inherited a lot of those fly hats. But with her hats, and comparing it to that of her ancestors, it was a step up. As I mentioned, this particular hat is one of the more elaborate ones, and she has some other ones that are kind of in between, but it was a step up from her ancestors. During my mother's generation, and my parents were born during the 1940s, and so it was tradition during the time, especially Easter, to wear hats and gloves and so forth. And so we have pictures of my mother and her sister with the hat and gloves, which I have one in that in the parlor over there. Later on in life, as an adult, I don't remember my mother wearing hats other than casual hats, but so she did not continue that legacy that her mother started with those hats. With my generation, as my sister mentioned, she's the one who's carrying it on, and two of the four of us, we are continuing in the hat legacy. And then we have a niece who's in her 20s. She's also continuing with that legacy, with that generation. Hats, especially with the African American, can be traced with migration and progress and status and hardship. If you can kind of judge the person's looking at their hats. If you look at some old pictures and so forth, some of them look real poor, some of them look a little bit more prosperous and so forth. One of the sayings that my grandmother had, and she came to Newport News in 1943. She married my grandfather. And prior to that, about 2 or 3 years before that, she left Ridgeway, North Carolina, which was a small town. She was motivated by hats as far as her leaving North Carolina, because some of her relatives from North Carolina had migrated to up north, and they would come back with the fly hat. And my grandmother, she wanted to look, she wanted a fly hat, so she said, I got to get out of here. So when she was about 18 years old, she left to go to Richmond, and then eventually she came to Newport News. A lot of grandma's stories, at least I'm finding now that she's gone, I'm finding that, I guess I'm was the only one listening to the stories. When I asked my sisters, do you remember grandma saying so and so? They don't remember. So either they probably weren't listening, I guess. But a lot of her stories were centered around hats and so forth. One of the sayings that she had, and this is something that we still continue today, kind of as a joke, but she used to always talk about look like you from the city. When we were planning a trip to North Carolina, she was always concerned, what are we going to wear? Because in her day, when you went back home, you couldn't just look any kind of way. Even if you weren't doing well, you need to at least look like you were doing well. And so that's where I guess that saying, look like you're from the city. So one of my nieces and I in particular, we joke, when somebody really looks good, instead of saying you look good, it's like, oh, you look like you're from the city.